Welcome to the Grand Theft World podcast, hosted and sponsored by grandtheftworld.com. It's May 8th, 2022. This is episode 79. We're going to look at the news, world events, current events from the past week. We're going to break it down. We're going to add some additional context, do some deep dives where necessary, get into the facts of the matter, primary evidence, sources, details, deep dives like that. And let's just take a little preview of what the 6 or 7 hour journey looks to be like tonight. We're going to start off by with a story about Rand Paul. He encountered finally the Orwellian Ministry of Truth. He bumped up against it. He had some comments exchanged with Mr. Mayorkas.
Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem. We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media? I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
Also, the CDC has classified freedom as a disease, and they're going to take all your personal data and they're going to see if they can prevent the next pandemic with it, but they might also be doing something else with your personal data.
The CDC bought data from millions of phones and are using it to track people and spy on them, even for stuff that ain't related to COVID. But the idea that vaccine passports could ever be misused is a conspiracy, and you're a conspiracy theorist. Shut up! Now let's get to the heart of the matter. 6 months ago, if I were to say this, hey, I bet the Centre for Disease Control will use that data to spy on you and possibly use it for non-COVID related matters, I would be kicked off this platform. And you know what people would say? Quite right, because the only thing that matters is protecting people from the pandemic. Why? Because human life is sacred. We have to protect each other. We have to look after one another. And that's the only reason. It's not about centralizing power. It's not about generating profit. It's not about controlling and manipulating populations. I can offer you that assurance because I'm, Anthony Fauci or whoever it is that said that kind of stuff. Well, now I've got some information for you. It comes from Vice or Motherboard or one of them places. And congratulations. And let's credit where it's due. When journalists do investigative journalism, let's thank them for that. That's literally what they're supposed to do. And thanks to their work, we can now tell you this. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, bought access to location data harvested from tens of millions of phones in the United States to perform analysis of compliance with curfews, track patterns of people visiting K-12 schools, and specifically monitor the effectiveness of policy in the Navajo Nation, according to CDC documents obtained by Motherboard. This might be a good time for you to ask yourself, what do you consider your relationship with the state to be? Do you consider the state to be a kind of a bureaucratic facilitator of convenience around like administrating hospitals and schools? And gosh, I suppose there are judicial issues and railways and energy. There's all sorts of things that need sorting out. I don't want to list it. It makes me bored even thinking about it. Or do you think that the state is sort of like a mum and dad figure, or perhaps more pertinently, a big brother that controls when you go out and what you do? And because none of us want that, that's obviously a rhetorical question, what has to be generated are circumstances that would facilitate that kind of relationship. If you are in perpetual fear, if you are under perpetual threat, if you are continually afraid, you'll accept a parent. When do you call out for mummy and daddy? When you're frightened, when the demons come. What if there are no demons coming? Demons are coming. We'll be doing another video soon about Bill Gates and the perpetual need for continual vigilance and new lockdowns that might be necessary. But for now, let's confine the conversation for the sake of clarity so you know exactly what I'm saying and exactly what I'm not saying. That the CDC were harvesting data. They were using data in ways they weren't transparent about. That hardly helps us not to fall into the realm of conspiracy theory, does it? Conspiracy theory is bred in the space between truth, transparency, and our experience. You're experiencing reality. This don't seem right. This don't seem right. This is not exactly what they're telling us. It don't seem right. So then you start to contemplate, well, what could it be? Well, I mean, if you start removing absolute trust for the government and government agencies and big corporations, it could be any number of things. So the only way to nullify that is to have trust in big governments. And the only way to do that is, is if they're trustworthy. But what do they do instead? Stop people talking, stop people communicating, shut down free speech. Can you see how this is enclosing around you? Sort of like some aperture shutting down. The image in my mind, if I'm going to be honest with you, is the James Bond credits, right? Okay. Ding, 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 ding. Ah! An even better image of a closing aperture is a squeezing anus. And that's the anus of justice, pinching off the poo-poo of truth. This is the news. Location data is information on a device's location sourced from the phone, which can then show where a person lives, works, and where they went. The sort of data the CDC bought was aggregated, meaning it was designed to follow trends that emerged from the movements of groups of people, but researchers have repeatedly raised concerns with how location data can be de-anonymized and then used to track specific people. I don't even like the first bit of being aggregated into a little herd of ants. I've said often that if it was mandatory to carry one of these things around, I would refuse to do it. If the government said, we're issuing everybody with one of these things, you better carry it everywhere and put it by your bed at night, and we'll be able to use this to market stuff at you that you don't want, make you feel insecure the whole time, and we'll be able to tell exactly where you are and what you're doing. Okay, you must be joking. There's no way. Put a £1,000 price tag. Oh, can I have one? Can I sleep on the pavement outside the shop so I can be first to be monitored? The documents reveal the expansive plan the CDC had last year to use location data from a highly controversial data broker, SafeGraph. The company CDC paid $420,000 for access to 1 year of data to includes Peter Thiel, the former head of Saudi intelligence, among its investors. Is this all good? Is this good? Is this what we were aiming for? The CDC used the data for monitoring curfews, with the documents saying that SafeGraph's data has been critical for ongoing response efforts, such as hourly monitoring of activity in the curfew zones, or detailed counts of visits to participating pharmacies for vaccine monitoring. The documents date from 2021. Zach Edwards, a cybersecurity researcher who closely follows the data marketplace, told Motherboard in an online chat after reviewing the documents that the CDC seems to have purposefully created an open-ended list of use cases which include monitoring curfews, neighbour-to-neighbour visits, visits to churches, schools and pharmacies. Motherboard obtained the documents for a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, request with the CDC. It's not like the information was revealed. It's not that they went, hey, listen, we at the CDC want to just let you know that all that stuff we said about not spying on you, it's not true. We are. Here's the information. Motherboard did some actual investigative journalism for a Freedom of Information Act, got hold of this stuff. The COVID-19 pandemic as a whole has been a flashpoint in a broader culture war, with conservatives and anti-vaccine groups protesting against government mask and vaccine mandates. They've also expressed a specific paranoia that vaccine passports would be used as a tracking or surveillance tool, framing vaccine refusal as a civil liberties issue. It's not a paranoia, is it? It's not paranoia if they are out to get you. It's not paranoia if they were lying. It's not a conspiracy theory if you can see, on one hand, freedom of speech is being curtailed and censorship is on the rise. On the other hand, data capture and spying is on the rise. On the other hand, the centralized, concentrated power between the state and big business is becoming more and more commensurate. That's not conspiracy theory. That's just a list of stuff.
And then we got a couple stories on the Billy Bob Gates. First, Bill Gates funds the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization wants to control you. Who controls the World Health Organization? Is it going to control the United States Constitution? Can a pandemic usurp your civil rights and the Bill of Rights and Constitution of this country? More to be learned there.
If we make the right investments, we won't need to live in fear of another COVID. We can build a health system that is ready to stop outbreaks before they go global. Here's how it should work. Epidemiologists will detect suspicious clusters of a disease that could cause a pandemic. A global team of 3,000 disease experts managed by the WHO, called the GERM team, will track the disease and share data and recommendations with governments. Governments and pharmaceutical companies will work together to use factories all over the world to get an unprecedented scale of diagnostics and vaccines very quickly. We'll have an agreed protocol and we'll understand how to share the results globally. Countries and the WHO will work in the best way to allocate these tools and to make sure that we have the logistics and delivery to get them to everyone who needs them. The key to be ready for a potential pandemic is to practice. And so this GERM team will work with each country to do GERM games, drills where you see, are you ready? Could you get the diagnostics out? So we're ready to go when we see the outbreak. Diseases are always going to spread among humans, but they don't have to become pandemics. You can read more about this in my new book, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic.
We'll also see a report from Kim Iverson, also digging into the massive influence peddled by Bill Gates without full disclosure to the public.
Well, just when you thought the COVID-19 pandemic was a once-in-a-lifetime experience with the shutdowns, mandated masks, required vaccines and passports, Bill Gates comes along and says, not so fast. Turns out COVID-19 was just one of many possible pandemics we might experience. But don't worry, you don't need to live in fear. Bill Gates has a plan. All right, well, he calls it the GERM team, GERM, which stands for Global Epidemic Response and Mobilization Initiative. He says the team would be managed by the World Health Organization. Besides nations who contribute, the top non-government donors to the WHO are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. But interestingly, Gavi's top donor is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So basically, it could be argued that the boss of the WHO is Bill Gates. So essentially, he'd be in charge of preventing future pandemics. Now, Gates says one of the goals of the GERM team is to prepare a plan to stop outbreaks before they go global. Okay, well, how do you stop a virus from spreading? What did we learn during this pandemic? We've learned it's nearly impossible to do, except in one circumstance, which is to do something similar to what China has done. Extreme, aggressive, and very authoritarian lockdowns. Now, if you're lucky, you're on an island that can close off its borders to prevent the virus from coming in which case maybe life would go on somewhat as normal, minus travelers, imports, and exports. But most of the world is not an island, and viruses are invisible. So trying to stop one from spreading would require, if it's even possible at all, a total China-style lockdown. Is that the idea? Or another way to stop a virus is to create a sterilizing vaccine that actually prevents the spread, if one could even be created at all. Now, Bill Gates says big pharma and governments would work together under his plan to whip out a vaccine, just like they did for COVID. The big question is, would they work with governments to mandate them again and require people to take them or lose their jobs and lose their ability to participate in society? Would they once again neglect treatment options? Would they look into repurposing generic drugs or even into natural options like promoting a healthy lifestyle? Or would it just be that because governments and organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation heavily invested in new vaccines, that they'd once again pursue a vaccine or bust strategy? Another thing Gates says the GERM team would do is detect suspicious clusters of diseases. They would then monitor them and do what they can to prevent them from spreading to pandemic levels. Well, that sounds like, on its surface, a good idea. Obviously, preventing a pandemic from happening at all is better than trying to deal with it once it's reached that level. But again, the question is, how do we prevent a virus from reaching pandemic levels when, first of all, the only possible but not bulletproof way to do it is through radical measures, and secondly, new viruses pop up all the time. Every few years we hear about a new virus like the bird flu or swine flu, SARS or Ebola. Now, luckily, these viruses didn't turn out to spread to levels authorities first presumed, but that's exactly the problem. If the new strategy is to implement radical measures to prevent pandemics each time a new virus is presumed to spread to pandemic levels, we could be seeing COVID-19 level measures every few years. They'd say they don't know which one is going to turn into the next COVID-19. So the only logical thing to do is to treat them all like they'd become the next COVID-19. Well, it turns out these radical measures we've been living through are exactly Bill's plan. In a blog post, Bill writes, quote, "Imagine a scenario like this. A concerning outbreak is rapidly identified by local public health agencies. If a threat is detected, governments sound the alarm and initiate public recommendations for travel, social distancing, and emergency planning. They start using the blunt tools that are already on hand, such as quarantines, antivirals that protect against almost any strain, and tests that can be performed anywhere. If this isn't sufficient, then the world's innovators immediately get to work developing new tests, treatments, and vaccines. Diagnostics, in particular, ramp up extremely fast so that large numbers of people can be tested in a short time. New drugs and vaccines are approved quickly because we've agreed ahead of time on how to run trials safely and share the results. Once they're ready to go into production, manufacturing gears up right away because factories are already in place and approved." Bill Gates goes on to say, "No one gets left behind because we've already worked out how to rapidly make enough vaccines for everyone. Everything gets where it's supposed to, when it's supposed to, because we've set up systems to get products delivered all the way to the patient. Communications about the situation are clear and avoid panic. And this all happens quickly," he says. "The goal is to contain outbreaks within the first 100 days before they ever have the chance to spread around the world. If we had stopped the COVID pandemic before 100 days, he says, we could have saved over 90% of the lives lost." Okay, now maybe that's all true that we could have spared lives from being lost from the virus, but what about the other harms the lockdowns and the depressing of the global economy has caused? People didn't get the cancer diagnosis they needed on time. Depression and suicide went through the roof, so did drug overdoses. Violent crime is way up, the list goes on. This is on top of the total neglect to find treatment options or adequately test existing ones. We're now over 700 days into this pandemic, and we're still speculating about the virus and even learning more about the vaccines. Bill talks about communication being clear to avoid panic, yet we can't even agree about the effectiveness as something as simple as a mask.
We're going to have a special guest later tonight. We're going to be talking about events that happened, well, about 20 years ago almost, and see how it's relevant to what's going on today. Still today is a lingering legacy of the 9/11 attacks and a loss of civil liberties, the Patriot Act, all sorts of egregious losses of freedom for other people around the world who didn't really have anything to do with the attacks. We're going to dig in and see what we can learn about that.
Because when Jim Meigs of Popular Mechanics was on debating this with the creators of Loose Change on Amy Goodman, back in the day, they had claimed that, you know, thermite it was ridiculous. It wasn't a military weapon. We actually found it in the Explosives for Sabotage handbook. I found it in several Army reference manuals for explosives. So proved that it's used by the military. It's in the manuals. And then we proved that it was also used to sever vertical steel columns with an article that one of our researchers found in an old issue of Popular Mechanics, where they demolished the Skyride Tower in Chicago using thermite to melt the legs. And so, like, everything that they said was wrong. And but yet they're still they still every year it gets put out like, oh, Popular Mechanics, they got it, they got the answer. Don't need to think for yourself, man. Why are you even thinking about it? And then, as always, to kick it off tonight, we're going to go to Luke Radowski from wearechange.org and bestpoliticaltshirts.com. And I want you to pay special attention to the beginning of this video. The people dressed in the hefty suits with the guns strapped to the outside where it says police on the back are shrink wrapping another human being. When are they going to unshrink wrap the human meat? I don't know. But some disturbing new footage that's coming out of China. And that's a place that didn't have freedom or civil rights or liberties to be lost in the first place. So you can see it as a, early warning sign of the loss of human beingness around the world in the name of pandemic and your safety. It's for your safety that they might shrink wrap you like that. So let's go ahead to Luke. We'll do the kickoff, and then we'll continue tonight's show all the way through the end of the wee hours of the morning. Let's go.
Yeah, talk about a sticky situation. And they probably discovered that the sickness somehow travels through your pants, and this is all being done for your health and safety. Stop questioning it.
What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions. We can get into the show and share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come